century. Three little British ships. Britain is the combination of England and Scotland that becomes a new nation, and they sail in from the Atlantic Ocean across the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay, 33 miles up the bottom river of this bay, which is called the James River. The Chesapeake Bay is a huge big body of water running north and south, and there are four major rivers that come off on a northwesterly slant. James River is 10 miles that way, York River 14 miles that way, the next one up is the Rappahannock, and the very large one, the next one up from that is called the Potomac. And that's where these British subjects came to, the bottom of the bay and then up the James River. They are not the Puritans. You have to leave those people up in New England, and the Puritans come later anyway. In 1607, they're loyal British subjects, members of the Anglican faith. They're here to have a better economic future. And some of them find it, not all of it, and they find it in the shape of a tobacco leaf. They discover they can grow tobacco, particularly in the 17th century, and have a great deal of profit from it. A few people make the wealth. A few people own most of the land, and they're the gentry. The majority of Virginians are poor farmers, dirt poor farmers. We'll talk about them in a minute. Anyway, they settled at Jamestown. The most important thing that happened at Jamestown Island in 1619 is the first meeting of representational government in this new world. If we are citizens of the United States of America today, we would be a whole different thing had we been Spanish or French colonies. England was a monarchy, but it had a form of self-government. And out of that form of self-government evolves the English Parliament, and out of that becomes what we call the Virginia Assembly, which half of the lower house gets elected. They're the Burgesses. That starts happening in 1619 at Jamestown. After a while, because in the beginning they didn't come inland, they spread up and down all their waterways, and every of the large tobacco plantations had its own pier, and its own marketplace had its pier. They really didn't come inland. But they started to later in the century, so by 1699, they decided to leave that first capital city, Jamestown, behind and build a new capital city and name it after the new monarch. His name was William, Duke of Gloucester. No, William. It wasn't Duke of Gloucester. And they named it the highest point of the peninsula. James River 10 miles that way, York River 14 miles that way. And there was a small town, but it was also a plantation called Middle Plantation, and there weren't a lot of buildings of substance. Bruton Parish Church has been there since 1633, the parish. And this building is 1715, so there was a smaller wooden structure before this one, which was standing in 1699. What was the scope of the most spectacular building in town had been completed in 1696. It was the College of William and Mary, chartered in 1693. This is a state church college, Anglican church, and never had more than 100 students. Girls didn't go to college then. They were boys, wealthy sons of wealthy have 5 or 6 professors, about 100 students. And this building is called the Williamsburg. Today it's a state university, has about 8,000 men and women on a huge campus around that. I suggest you go and visit the then building. It's open, and during the day I think it closes around 5, and they've restored parts of it. And then go to the back portico and look out toward the west, and that you begin to see the modern day campus of William and Mary. Starting with that as his point, he went almost a mile, and directly to the east he placed the new Capitol building. In doing so, he is creating something that is very classical, and in the ancient cities of Rome and Greece, they were very involved in creating vistas, to use these perspectives off to the distance. This is the late Renaissance, so Frank Nicholson is using classical design. In order to create another vista, he puts the palace to the north, okay, and then buys the land on the other side of this main street to have the governor's vista terminate off into the forest. Main Street was called Duke of Gloucester Street, named after Queen John. Probably if you were Gloucester, think Dr. Gloucester went to Gloucester, and you'll always have it right. Not paved in the 18th century, mud, dust, lots of pollution, animal and human, floating around this town. They don't understand the germ theory yet, so sanitation is not an issue with them. I think to really do it, this town on all levels, one level should be the level of imagination. And you can start trying to recreate the reality of the 18th century, and you will end up loving 1996. Let's go this way. Survival information, if you will open your maps and put this corner right here, okay, in that direction, even though it feels awkward to you, just do that for now so we get a sense of where we are. Thanks, Alice, that is good. This is color-coded, this map, and you can see the key right up here in the corner. Red are exhibition buildings, yellow are stores, blue are restaurants, green means the National Historic Landmark, darker green on lighter green means gardens of interest. And we are right here. There's the college down there, there's Merchant Square, and then if you can see this red sign blob right there, okay, that's the Saddle Maker, and that garden of interest, the one that the two gardens we walked through are right there. Okay. Let's start over here and come in on the bus. Bus stop number 1 is right there, behind, next to the palace. And then it goes in only one direction and it only stops at the marked stops. The next one is bus stop number 2. Okay, you have passed the Palo property. I recommend the Palo property to everybody. It's not opened all year long. It's staffed in the summer, and it's interactive. Whatever's going on in an 18th century household that day of the week, I think they're ironing today, and they're doing all kinds of things, particularly for the kids. They'll have all kinds of activities for the kids there. And then there's Christiana Campbell's, the Capitol. Bus stop 2 also serves Bassett Hall. Now, if you see south of Francis Street, which is in that direction, outside of the green, like those hotels in Bassett Hall and a couple of museums, this is where the Rockefellers lived while they were involved in the restoration, usually in the spring and the fall of every year. It's not on the basic tickets. So if you have a ticket other than the basic ticket, you want to see it, you need to make a reservation, and you can make them any place that you can buy tickets, and they'll make a reservation.
This is the pew of Patrick Henry. And this is the pew of George Washington.
John Greenhow and his wife.
This is James Monroe's pew.
Their home was served.
Thomas Jefferson's pew. John Tyler's pew.
Ready, Katie?
Hey, that's cheap.
Keith, you want to get in this one with me?
I can't.
Oh, you
Where you take the camera from Dad and put Dad in it.
Yes. What's that new movie that's out? Parent? Or the kids
Oh,
watch it?
parent arrest.
Parent Arrest.
No, house arrest.
House Arrest.
No, it's parent arrest.
No, it's House Arrest.
House arrest.
I just push this button up here.
You have to hold it down. 'Cause it
What about it, Mom?
Julia, get out of the picture.
Okay. In it.
10 years later.
At the end of the roll. I think that many
Oh, you
people.
guys,
Okay, now
you can
somebody
open
let me
it.
out.
2 or 3 pictures.
You guys can open it now. I'm getting kind of.
Oh, really?
Stuck?
You can get yours out. Point your toes.
Looks like you need some now, Mom,
Point
too.
them out here.
I can't. They still don't fit. You open up the thing and let me out.
How do you close the...
Turn it off. You just close it.
Why don't you guys
Close
get
the front lid.
If you had to give it a name, what would you call this machine?
What does it use? What's the force it's used?
We apply pressure by, well, press it down, right? Call it press. Its formal name was letterpress or printing press. And as we have these done, Chris will then hang them up to dry. And depending on the humidity, they dry quickly or not so quickly. Do you think they dry? The copies that Chris hung on the ropes yesterday, I came in this morning, took them down and put them in a whole other room to dry. Actually, a room where everything mildews. It's probably not a good idea to dry copies, but we tried it anyway.
Whatever you want to trim off the book, you leave showing above the surface. So if you want to take an eighth of an inch off, and then by pushing this backwards and forwards, and this, I'm retracting the blade right now. Can you see it?
Yes, I
Excuse me,
can.
it's moving.
Sure.
So when you push that backwards and forwards, that blade is going to slice into the side of the book that's exposed by pushing it backwards and forwards.
And then
It
you
cuts
just
the top
keep,
of the book off. Keep
you
advancing.
keep it trapped and advance it. So
That's
it's-
right. So
This must have to be very, very sharp to
yes, it
do
does.
that. Wow.
Be careful with it because it is sharp. For something like paper, as I said, paper cutters, no, we didn't really have paper cutters or knives. What we would do if we wanted to separate a piece of paper, take a straight edge like this. Just basically put that on there. You want to cut that across there. Well,
Layout artists still do that, but
I don't care if it was young.
No, it's the guys who made the.
I wouldn't want. What is this?
This is for making the paper. They boil the clothes and then they put a screen. I've done that recently. Make paper.
Are you a paper maker?
Well, no, I just went to this class a friend of mine was doing. And she
Stuck
had
into
some
the
paper
fridge.
molds, and they just took old paper, newsprint, whatever, and you put it in and cook it
Cook it.
till it gets all pulpy. And then you can put it in a paper mold.
Ooh,
and
that was fun.
it's a small version of that thing. And it is, it's a screen sort of thing, and she puts like little wildflowers and stuff in it.
A lot of the art.
The head of the empire, sir. We must show proper obedience and loyalty. Right. It's very unfortunate not to like him. He's a very conscientious mother. But, sir, why do you not like him?
Now that's hard.
That's hard. Well, I understand. Perhaps I withdraw the question if it is too difficult. But perhaps it is the oppression that you feel from the mother country that you live in. The taxes laid upon us by Parliament without our consent.
Now where am I from?
For Mr. Jefferson complains of those.
You're from Massachusetts.
I am. No.
Oh, I might have
What's
done
the
it.
other town?
Wow.
I think it was Williamsburg. That was. No, for Colonial Day.
Oh, you were from Plymouth.
Oh yeah, huh? We were from. Huh.
If you are from Massachusetts, sir, I will understand your detestation of King and Parliament. Yes. But come, sir, have you not brought it upon yourselves by taking it upon yourselves to dump the tea into the harbor? Now, come, sir, was that a rational act?
Yes.
Was that a...
Necessary?
Yes, was it necessary? Was it a polite thing to do?
Yeah.
I think that it has greatly increased the distress of the people in Boston.
Oh, well, at least we made a point.
You were heard, sir, I'll grant you that. But have you not made Parliament irate? So angry that they would close the Boston port?
Yeah, that's the bad part.
However, it is played into the hands of the Bostonians, does it not? Now, Boston has the sympathy of all 13 colonies.
Yeah.
Send them aid, they say. Send them food. Send them money. So that,
Because all this shipping from England comes into the harbor, and so since our harbor is closed, we don't get any food.
you are dependent upon the ocean for your livelihood, your commercial livelihood. And so that is a great point of vulnerability. However, I will say, you patriots have made the most of it. You have excited the sensibilities of all the colonies, and including many of my subscribers, I must admit.
One person I should thank, Paul Revere.
Paul Revere. And who is he?
You don't know him?
No. No. Oh, is he that fellow who took the message to the General Congress with certain resolves, claiming that Parliament had no rights over us? I believe I did read of him in the Gazettes. Has he done something more?
Oh, yes, very much.
You see. So,
No Britain?
yes.
No, okay.
Well, they were coming to attack us in Massachusetts. Yes. And Paul Revere kind of spied on them and knew it, except all the other patriots did not know. So at night, since he knew that, it's like the night before all this happened, the war that was going to happen, he rode into town and told everybody that the British were coming. And so they got everything. This was a sneak attack from the Britons.
Sneak attack. I can't imagine such a thing, sir. What? Perhaps you... I have heard of the battles of Concord and Lexington. But do you know, sir, that at the same time that General Gage was removing the powder from the hands of the Patriots, that our Governor Dunmore was also removing it from the powder magazine here in Williamsburg. Have you seen the powder magazine?
Yeah, you said,
Yeah, I
It
did.
is the 8-sided
was all the
building
muskets?
in the center of
That.
town.
Yeah, you know, they did the same thing here the next day that they had tried to do in Lexington and Concord and didn't succeed.
And sir,
Thanks
it
to
was
Paul
in
Revere warning
response
everybody.
to a general order, or at least comment by the Secretary for the American Colonies in England, who recommended to all the governors that they secure the powder and weapons for the sake of peace and good order. So, sir, I think you misapprehend that this was no sneak attack, as you say, but simply an attempt to preserve the peace of the colony.
No. What? Then why did the governor do it in the middle of the night?
Well, as he told my partner, John Dixon, the mayor of the city, and Mr. Peyton Randolph, when they went to the governor's palace to question him, he told them, he said, that he did not wish to disturb the people by removing the powder. And he furthermore added that he thought it would not be a good thing to put powder and shot in their hands in their current mood, for they were very irate during it.
They just assumed they wouldn't notice it was gone.
Well, I'm sure he was ready to, as he did later, to tell the House of Burgesses what he had done.
Look, there's the map.
After all, he is
Right up there above his head.
he is the commander-in-chief of His Majesty's forces
Right out here in the middle of the mill pond.
in Virginia. And therefore, the powder actually
Mill pond?
belongs to you.
That's why we lived in Back Bay.
Ah, yes, you found the map.
Oh, yes. We lived there for a long time.
Mill pond they lived on.
Wait a minute, that's not Beacon Hill. Oh, it is. No,
There's the common
oh, yeah, no, that is Beacon Hill. No, we lived out here.
in the
No.
flats.
Well, this is now Back Bay. And Newberry Street. Oh, I didn't, yeah, that's right. I know, I forget that this part was water.
Oh, Boston is an island, as you know,
No.
connected only by a small road, and that. And this little road has now been fortified by Governor Gage.
See, all the water from here, wait, yeah, was washed out. So there's now new land, and so that's where they're from.
So they haven't done that for 100 years, so he doesn't know about that part yet. They didn't do that until 1850.
What about the mill?
You can walk a horse into the water and then let the leeches swim towards the horse and pick them up. Or they'll recommend that you walk alongside the river with the net and scoop them up. And there's a little...
Poor horses.
Poor horses. Yeah. There's a little barrel behind you next to the window, and that's where you put them in to shut them in. And then we have little tweezers so we can pick them up out of the jars so they don't cause any problems till we put them on the station.
So when you try to feed them, you like put them in another container
You
with.
just pick them up and put them in another container.
Does it have? Is it damp in there? So ill.
You can leave them out of water for a good half hour and they're fine.
Oh, yes. Back there.
They're gone.
All you folks today to the Capitol building. My name is Tom, and I'll be leading you to the Capitol today. As we explore this building, I'll also be talking about the American Revolution, because the American Revolution did have an impact on this building and the men that met here. Folks like to join us here on the benches. We've got another bench over here we can use. Now, I'd like to take you back to those days and times, to colonial Virginia. If you were living here in those days, this building would have represented two things to you. One, it represented England itself, and you're going to see a lot of symbols or signs of England outside as well as inside this building. But I think we can all see that very large symbol of England today, the British flag flying over the Capitol. Now, these symbols of England were here to remind these men of who they should be loyal to. They should be loyal to the king, and they should be loyal to the British Empire. Now, this building was also important to these Virginians because it represented their government right here in Virginia. In fact, all 13 colonies had created their own governments before the Revolutionary War. Now, here in Virginia, Virginia's colonial government was made up of the royal governor. He was the king's representative here. The governor lives up the street in the governor's palace. But along with that royal governor were two houses of men that also formed Virginia's colonial government. Now, one house met on this side of the Capitol right behind me. They were called the Governor's Council. Now, this group of men was very close-knit, a very exclusive group of men. Only 12 in all were serving in this house. But these 12 men, though, represented a lot of power, a lot of wealth here in Virginia. They represented the old families of Virginia, families that have been here for generations, the families like the Carters and the Lees, the Nelsons and the Pagers. Now, these 12 men, called the Governor's Council, were appointed by the King of England to serve in that one house. Now, the other house of Virginia's colonial government met over on that side. They were called the House of Burgesses. Burgesses simply meaning a body of men. Each county here in Virginia was allowed to elect 2 men to serve in that House of Burgesses. Now, George Washington, Jefferson, and Henry, these names you probably recognize, they got their starting government by serving in the House of Burgesses. Now, I like to call that house the People's House because I've already mentioned those men have been elected to serve in that house. Elected by some of the people here in Virginia, but not all the people. In fact, most Virginians back then did not have the right to vote. 5 strict voting requirements back then in order to vote. They were, you had to be white, you had to be a male, you had to be 21 years of age or older, you had to be a property owner, you also had to be a Protestant. And if you're not one of these things, you're not going to be voting here in Virginia. So you can see it really limited who got the right to vote in those days, and it did not represent a true democracy as we know it today in our country, yet those men have been elected by at least some of the people here in Virginia, unlike that group of 12 men who had been appointed by the King of England. Newspapers and legal documents in these 13 colonies. But they will protest over here against this stamp tax because now they were being taxed without their consent or approval. They had no representatives back there in England, in the English government, so now they're being taxed without their consent. Here's the rallying cry of no taxation without representation. So that's one big right they felt the English government was taking away from them. But there's another right they were equally concerned about losing, and this right concerned a courtroom right, a right you would have in the courtroom back in those days. And it's a right we still enjoy today in our country. Now we're going to find out about that right and other courtroom rights when we enter a courtroom. In fact, the first room we go into is a courtroom here in the Capitol. Now, let's see, I think I have enough here today. I need 3 volunteers today. I already see the hands going up. Well, how about this young lady right here? Let's see, how about this young lady right over here in that hat? Okay, let me see if I can get a gentleman. How about you right back there? There we go. Now, I also need a couple more volunteers in there, so I'll point that out. So will you come on up front here? You might want to give your water bottle to someone. All right, I'll point out another place for you to volunteer in there today. All right. Now, before we go into that courtroom, I always like to point out the bridge of the Capitol because we can see that bridge very clearly today. It's that room right up there. Now, I call that room the bridge because it connects or bridges the 2 different sides of the Capitol. A little bit later on, we'll be going up there. First of all, we're going to step into that courtroom. So you 3 are going to follow behind me. The rest of you folks are going to follow behind my volunteers today. You folks, come on in.
Order in the court!
Oh, very good, Sheriff. I think I need to hire you full-time here. Very good. Now you can step back there. I think you got their attention, all right? All right, our sheriff has just called us to order in the court, and that's exactly where we are, courtroom. In fact, this was the highest court in Virginia. This was called the General Court. Now, this General Court would hear a lot of important cases back then. They were usually being, these cases they were hearing in this courtroom were usually being appealed from lower courts here in Virginia. Lower courts were called county courthouses. And there's a county courthouse today about 3 blocks down this main street. That's the one across from the magazine, and that's where the stocks are set up. So that's a lower court, but this was the highest court, the General Court. Now, this court has jurisdiction over all felony trials of a free person here in Virginia. So you could have been a white person, a Native American, or free black. If you've been accused of a felony crime, things like murder, stealing, arson, or treason, well, your trial would automatically be heard in this General Court. Now, sitting to hear the cases in this courtroom are 13 very powerful men, the justices of the General Court. We'll find out about these men in just a few minutes. Now, another right the colonists felt they were going to be denied by the English government, or have this right taken from them by the English government, was a right we still enjoy today in our country, a legal right, which is a right to a trial by jury. Because the English government has said that not only were they going to tax these colonists over here without their consent, they also decided that certain criminals here in the colonies, people accused of smuggling, would be taken back to England for trial, and these trials in England would take place in front of judges and no juries. So now they're about ready to lose this legal right. Now, to talk a little bit more about courtroom rights that existed in those days, we're going to recreate an actual trial that took place in this General Court in the 1700s. My other 2 volunteers are going to help me out in this matter today, so if you 2 will step forward. Right, that's good right there. Now this trial in the 1700s involved a man by the name of Jonathan Faithful. This is Mr. Faithful today. He is our defendant. He has been accused of a most serious crime, the crime of stealing. He's been accused of stealing from the individual beside him, our plaintiff today, Mr. Hornsby. Now the charge is, to be more specific here, is that Mr. Faithful here has stolen some food and wine from Mr. Hornsby's storehouse. Now Mr. Hornsby, you can step back to the railing. Mr. Faithful, you're going to have to stay up here and turn and face this group here on the benches. Now Mr. Faithful, how are you going to plead today to this charge of stealing? Are you going to plead, or just what's your plea? Are you guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Of course, very well. And tell them that. I'm not me. Tell them that.
I'm not guilty.
Okay, very good. He is innocent of this charge of stealing. Mr. Faithful here has just entered his verdict, or entered his plea, I should say, to his jury. And this is his basic legal right that back then, a jury trial. So his jury is going to look a lot different than the juries we know today in our country. Because in order to sit on that jury back then, you had to be able to vote. So his jury consisted of 12 white men that were 21 years of age or older, property owners, and Protestants. Now, Mr. Faithful, you do have a couple other legal rights today, which I'll inform you about. You do have a right to a lawyer back then, but only if you could afford one. If you're a poor individual, there's no public defenders. They're not going to provide you with one. The original Mr. Faithful here was an indentured servant, which meant he was very poor, and basically he had to take care of himself in court back then, and that's what he's going to do today. Sorry about that, Mr. Faithful. Now, he has a couple other rights. He can call witnesses to speak on his behalf. He had the right to confront witnesses, people speaking against him, and he certainly had the right to face his accusers in open court. Accuser back there, Mr. Hornsby, here's an open court for the general public to watch. Any guest of the royal governor can watch from the balconies above. Now, Mr. Faithful, this is your time to explain your side of the story to this jury. You don't have that much to say. You can say, I didn't do it, and that's fine.
I didn't do it.
All right, very good. Jury, he's still saying very emphatically that he didn't do it. He's innocent. Very good. Now, once his side has been heard, Mr. Hornsby will be allowed to speak. So if you step back, Mr. Hornsby, come forward here. Now, in the original court proceedings, Mr. Hornsby testified that on the night in question he heard a commotion or a noise in his slave quarters. He owned some slaves. When he went out to investigate, his slaves had caught Mr. Faithful, and when they searched him, they found two things on him. They found a bag of food on him. The food had been taken from Mr. Hornsby's storehouse. They also found a key on him. Now, they went back to the defendant's room to investigate further, and they found a large chest in that room. They opened it with that key, and when they looked inside, what did they find? But some more of Mr. Hornsby's food and wine had been stolen from his storehouse. Now, the testimony would be very damaging to Mr. Faithful back then if the slaves testified, because they caught him in the act of stealing. But by law back then, a slave could not testify against a white individual, so Mr. Hornsby here would have to give this information in court. And once his side has been heard, it's this jury's time to decide and deliberate. You can step back, Mr. Hornsby. Thank you. Now, after hearing about Mr. Faithful today, is he guilty or not guilty of stealing?
Not guilty.
Not guilty! Oh, you're good enough! Yo! Well, Mr. Faithful, you're so lucky indeed. Thank you for your service, Mr. Foreman. The original Mr. Faithful, though, wasn't so lucky because Mr. Faithful was convicted. Now, one piece of evidence that jury knew back then that I didn't tell my jury today was that he had been convicted in this general court once before of another crime. And they felt, well, he's committed a crime in the past, he's likely to have committed this crime. Now, after this second conviction, Mr. Faithful was sentenced, and he was sentenced to death. And he would be taken about a mile outside of town, and that's where he was hung. So you're very fortunate today, Mr. Faithful, that this jury is deciding your case. Now, the jury back then would not decide the punishment. The punishment would be decided by the justices sitting up there. One man up there is the royal governor. He sits there in that very large chair. But the other 12 men are equally as powerful. These are the 12 Virginians who have been appointed by the king to serve in that one house of Virginia's government. So all of these men back there have judicial powers in this room. The next one. All right. Well, this is the room I pointed out to you out on those benches, the bridge of the Capitol. Call this the bridge because all that on that side of the Capitol, the side we just left, that's the king's side. All those men over there have been appointed by the king. In a few minutes, we're going to go downstairs, and that's where the House of Burgesses had met. That house had been elected by some of the people here in Virginia. So everything beyond this wall is the people's side. Here's the room that bridges or connects the two different sides. This delegates. Do that properly. We all need to stand and rise just for a second. Mr. President, you also stand, sir. convention or meeting, the number one topic or issue is independence. They're still debating it. They still haven't declared it yet. So that's the big issue. But the other issue they're facing here in Virginia is what to do about the government. Because when the war had started the year before, I mentioned that royal governor, he had taken off, he had fled onto a ship. That group of 12 men, the governor's council, they had broken up and gone their separate ways. The last remaining house of Virginia's government, the House of Burgesses, well, they really couldn't proceed to business without half the government missing there. So the government had been kind of in limbo for almost a year, so that's something else they had to resolve. Now most of these men meeting at this 5th Virginia Convention had been members of the House of Burgesses before the war. Basically, it's the same group of men doing all this stuff. Now, the room we're in today is where the House of Burgesses, the People's House, had met before the war. The men serving as speaker would be sitting right back in the speaker's chair, and that is the original speaker's chair. Now, by May of 1776, the Revolutionary War had been going on for almost a year now. While the fighting has taken place, these delegates had pretty well decided that the time for talk was about almost over with. Now, a few of the men that will be speaking here at this convention, well, I'm going to read you some of their thoughts. And again, remember, consider all these things when you're going to take this vote for independence. Now, one man that is here that will be speaking is Patrick Henry. He's already given, at the second meeting of convention in Richmond, that very stirring speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." And he's going to give an equally strong one here. This is what Patrick Henry says. "The King of Great Britain, by a long series of oppressive acts, has proven himself the tyrant instead of the protector of the people. I resolve that our delegates in Congress push for immediate and full declaration of independence for all the colonies." Now, Mr. Henry has just stated that the only way to protect their rights and liberties is to have all 13 colonies declare independence. Now, here we can